Genesis 3:16 is often understood as divine punishment, where women are condemned to suffer physical pain in childbirth due to Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. This interpretation has been the traditional view for a long time and has caused many to struggle with questions about God's justice. However, recent scholarship challenges this understanding. Genesis 3:16 is not about physical pain in childbirth, but rather emotional and psychological grief related to fertility, barrenness, and conception. Most traditional translations of Genesis 3:16 read something like this: "I will make your pains and childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children." This reading leads many to conclude that physical pain in childbirth is a direct punishment for Eve's disobedience. But Christine Curley and Brian Peterson argue that this understanding misses a critical aspect of the Hebrew text. They suggest that a more accurate translation would be, "I will greatly increase your sorrowful conceptions." This reframes the verse, not as a curse of physical pain, but as a statement about the emotional grief and turmoil tied to conception, barrenness, and the uncertainty of fertility. To better understand this view, let's analyze the key Hebrew terms in Genesis 3:16. The word itsabon is commonly translated as pain or toil, but modern linguistic resources reveal something else. Itsabon appears 3 times in the Old Testament: Genesis 3:16, Genesis 3:17, and Genesis 5:29. Because Genesis 3:16 is the one in question, we should look at the other 2. And what we find is that in these cases, it carries emotional rather than physical connotations. Most importantly, in Genesis 3:17, the term describes Adam's emotional toil with the ground after the fall, highlighting the emotional toll of his labor in a broken world, creating a parallelism with Genesis 3:16, where itsabon refers to the emotional grief and turmoil that accompanies conception and childbearing in a fallen world. Next, let's consider herayon, which is traditionally translated as childbearing or pregnancy. According to modern linguistic tools, herayon specifically refers to the process of conception rather than childbirth itself. If this is true, then Genesis 3:16 is not focused on the physical act of delivering a child, but on the emotional and psychological challenges surrounding conceptions, especially issues like infertility and miscarriage, which were significant sources of grief for women in the ancient world. This interpretation is further strengthened by the fact that Hebrew has specific words for childbirth and labor pains, none of which are used in Genesis 3:16. For example, yalad. This verb has 497 occurrences in the Hebrew Bible and is used to describe the act of giving birth or delivering a child. If Genesis 3:16 were emphasizing the physical process of childbirth, we would expect yalad to be present. Its absence indicates that the verse is focusing on something different. Another pair of terms to consider is kul and chabal. Kul, meaning to writhe or to twist, is often associated with the physical motions of distress or labor pains. For example, in Isaiah 26:17, it is used to describe a woman in labor writhing in pain. Chabal, meaning cord or band, can metaphorically refer to pangs or distress, particularly in contexts involving childbirth or intense suffering. It is used in passages like Jeremiah 22:23 to convey the emotional and physical pain of labor. Yet, Genesis 3:16 does not use these terms, further suggesting the verse does not focus on physical labor pains. The absence of these specific words for labor and childbirth in Genesis 3:16 strongly suggests that the text is not focused on physical pain during labor, but rather on an emotional burden tied to conception and fertility. If the author's intentions were to portray the physical pain of childbirth, why would they not use the words commonly used for those circumstances? Finally, let's look at etseb, often translated as pain or sorrow. Like itsabon, our linguistic resources indicate that itsab refers to emotional suffering or grief, or in some cases, toil. The only time we see it refer to physical pain is, again, the verse we have in question here, Genesis 3:16. But now we have a stack of evidence against this rendering of the word. So why interpret this word to mean physical pain when there's no reason to do so? In Genesis 3:16, itsab is better understood to emphasize the emotional toll of conception and childbearing in a broken world. The grief Eve experiences is relational and emotional, much like the emotional turmoil Adam faces in his work with the ground. Next are some contextual and syntactical considerations. Curley and Peterson argue that Genesis 3:16 employs a literary device called hendiadys, where two words combine to express a single idea. In this case, the phrase sorrowful conceptions is intended to be understood as a unified expression of emotional grief associated with fertility struggles rather than separating sorrow from childbirth. Moreover, the curse on Eve is paralleled by the curse on Adam in Genesis 3:17. Both Adam and Eve are subjected to toil. Eve's emotional grief is tied to fertility and conception, while Adam's toil is tied to working the ground. Both curses reflect the emotional and physical struggles of life in a world marred by sin. Productivity for both Adam and Eve is hindered. For Eve, it's in childbearing, and for Adam, it's in cultivating food. Next, we have to consider the following. The theme of barrenness and infertility is prevalent throughout the book of Genesis, particularly in the stories of the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. These stories reflect the emotional societal pressures surrounding conception and fertility in the ancient world. The sorrow and grief these women experienced are deeply tied to the emotional burden described in this reading of Genesis 3:16. In other words, this reading ties together the narrative of Genesis, giving the text much more cohesion. For example, Sarah's barrenness becomes a key element in the narrative of Genesis, representing a deep emotional and relational struggle. Similarly, Rachel's plea, "Give me children or I'll die," in Genesis 30, verse 1, reflects the desperation and emotional pain that often accompanied the desire for children in a society where fertility was highly valued. Lastly, another key phrase in Genesis 3:16 is, "Your desire will be for your husband." Traditionally, this has been interpreted as referring to sexual desire or submission, but Curley and Peterson argue that the phrase reflects something deeper. They suggest that this verse is not about God actively cursing Eve with a desire and subjugation, but rather describing the natural consequences of a broken world after the fall. In the ancient world, a woman's identity was often tied to her ability to bear children, and the inability to conceive was not just a personal hardship, but a blow to her social standing and sense of self. Curley and Peterson argue that the phrase, "Your desire will be for your husband," is a statement about how, in a fallen world, women would experience a deep emotional vulnerability tied to societal pressures around fertility and motherhood. This is not something God imposed upon Eve, but rather a description of the reality that would unfold as part of the fractured relationships brought about by sin. The emotional weight of infertility would drive women to seek validation through conception, turning to their husbands for help in bearing children. In this way, men often became the enforcers of these social expectations. And Curley and Peterson argue that this dynamic, where women are emotionally vulnerable due to the societal pressure to bear children, and men exploit this dependence, reinforces patriarchal power structures. This power imbalance is a consequence of the fall, not a command of God. Rather than prescribing what should happen, Genesis 3:16 is describing the distorted relationships between men and women that will arise as a result of the fall. Eve's desire for her husband and her emotional vulnerability stem from her need to fulfill societal expectations through bearing children, which men often used to assert dominance in the relationship. Closely linked to the motif of human barrenness is the concept of the land's barrenness, or famine, which directly impacts both men and women in the patriarchal narratives. Genesis repeatedly tells us of the ancestral figures, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, facing famine in the land of God that was promised to them, a land described as flowing with milk and honey. Curley and Peterson highlight how famine in the land reflects the broader theme of barrenness, not only for women but also for men. The land, which was intended to be fruitful, becomes barren, symbolizing the emotional turmoil experienced by the patriarchs, especially when they had to leave the promised land due to famine. For instance, both Abraham and Jacob moved their families to Egypt to escape famine, while Isaac is forbidden by God from doing so, but still must endure the hardship of famine in Canaan. These stories of famine represent a form of emotional grief for men, echoing the emotional toll that women experience through barrenness and infertility. The land's failure to produce mirrors the frustration and sorrow that women endure through conception. They both have to experience these things under the fall. In conclusion, Genesis 3:16 should not be understood as a curse of physical pain, but as emotional and psychological grief tied to conception, barrenness, and fertility. This understanding aligns more closely with the broader narrative of Genesis, particularly the struggles of the matriarchs with fertility and societal pressures they had faced. Rather than reading Genesis 3:16 as a punishment of physical pain, we can understand it as a profound statement about the emotional and relational struggles that define life in a fallen world. And this perspective allows us to see the text as relevant not only for the ancient world, but also for modern experiences of infertility and emotional grief. As we wrap up today's discussion, I want to remind you that at Exploring Reality, our mission is fueled by individuals like you. Your support is the foundation that allows us to continue creating content that challenges, inspires, and equips people in their journey of faith. It also enables me to speak at churches and universities where we can engage with diverse audiences, making a tangible impact on lives and spreading truth in critical spaces around the world. If you found this video valuable, we invite you to become a partner in this mission. Your contributions allow us to continue this vital work. Visit our website to learn how you can join our community of supporters and help make a lasting difference.